Hi, I'm Denny Dumas. This is my partner James Garbutt, and today we're going to be talking to you all about oil tanks. James is our in-house vice president of oil tank investigation, so he's going to be leading this one. James?
All right, this is my specialty, Danny. Thank you for the introduction. I appreciate that. I have personally had 2 oil tanks on properties that I've owned, so I have some personal experience, plus a number of clients that have had to deal with them in the past. So I'm going to try to take you through a lot of the process. So let's start with investigation. You found a house that you love, and part of your due diligence is to, well, one, you want to write an offer on this home, or 2, you're just doing an inspection. So we want to find out if there is an oil tank. So oil tanks typically exist on homes that were built in 1960s or earlier. It doesn't mean all homes had them back then, but it's more common with those homes. And in some rare cases, it exists in 1970s built homes as well. But that's the end of the era. The easiest thing where to start is when you are interested in a property, you look at the property disclosure statement. There's an oil tank clause in that disclosure, and you'll find out if the seller is aware of one or not. But I wouldn't simply rely on that paperwork. I would go the next level and phone the authority that the city uses. You know, every city's different, but in, say, New Westminster, for example, the Fire and Safety Authority hold the records of oil tank removal. If they have a record showing it's being removed, it is important to go even one step further and ask what documentation they have. Keep in mind, a removal that was done 15 years ago is to a different standard than the one that was done today. If they removed a tank 15, 20 years ago, there may not have been soil testing, for example. Secondly, some of these authorities keep on record oil tank scans of properties, and scans don't always have conclusive results. So if the city says there's no tank, ask them what documents that they have to back that up, or the fire authority. So let's go into, you've gone through those stages and you still believe there's no tank, but you don't have certainty. So what's the next level of investigation? The simplest oil tank scan is like a metal detector, and it is very helpful to just do a simple base oil tank scan. They run around $100. It's someone that knows to look for oil tanks, and they use a metal detector, but those are really only a more trusted result if there's no obstacles in the way. So if you have a house that is surrounded by dirt and lawn with no major trees or bushes or decks or metal or concrete with rebar in it that would obstruct a metal detector scan, and it's just all dirt and easy, then yeah, go with the simple scan. But if there's a lot of concrete with rebar in it or obstacles in the way, obstacles with metal in it that may affect those results, it's better to go with the next level up scan, which is a ground penetrating radar scan. Those are about $400 to $500. Now, those are great for scanning through concrete pads with rebar, but they can't access under decks. So if the home that you're scanning for has a lot of side, front porches, back decks, and say they're 2 or 3 feet off the ground with stuff cluttered underneath them, one, the scanners can't get underneath them, so those decks would either have to be deassembled, removed, or you just have to be okay with some exceptions to the scan. These are common cases that we come around. We don't have always an answer for. Some people are willing to take the risk saying 80% of the property was great and scanned clean, but we couldn't get underneath that deck, and you have to live with that. At the end of the day, these are just proactive investigations that you can do to find the likelihood of an oil tank. Now, if you have obstacles in the way and you can't get around that, and the seller doesn't want to remove their deck so that you know there's no tank, there's clauses that you can put into offers that can protect you on different levels. So let's talk about the ultimate scenario. The ultimate scenario is you put in a really big fat oil tank clause that puts the seller on ongoing liability if a tank is ever found. This is what us realtors love to put in our offers just to give our buyers peace of mind. But let's be honest, if they find a tank 5 years down the road, it's hard and it's not a fun process as chasing an old seller for that money. So we try to avoid at all costs. We try to get certainty on oil tanks before completion whenever we can. But step one, if you're in a one-on-one negotiation or if the seller is going to allow it, try to put in an oil tank clause that keeps them accountable and on hook for liability. If they don't like that, which in some cases they do, or if you're in a multiple offer situation, you have to make your offer look better, you can get away with maybe a 1-year clause where the seller's liable for up to 1 year if a tank is found. So after you own the property, you decide, hey, I'm going to remove that balcony to find out if there's a tank underneath of it. You have the option to do so. But I find that more sellers are receptive to a limited liability, like 1 year, say, as opposed to ongoing forever. The other thing is some sellers may not want any liability. They would say, you know what? I don't know if there's a tank. There's trees everywhere. There's balconies everywhere. There's junk all over my yard. It is what it is. You're buying it as is. I'm not doing anything. If that's the case and you can't get away with an oil tank clause, there might be a foreclosure or any circumstance where they're not going to take on that liability, then you really have the only option of reverting back to doing as much investigation as possible. And that is scan what you can scan and remove any debris that you can that would affect a scan result. And at the end of the day, you may have to take on some liability and just be okay with it. Some things to consider that, one, not all removals are the same. So, as I mentioned, if there's record of removal without soil test results, it could bring up red flags with some lenders. I've run into that case myself where there was a tank removed, but no soil test to back it up. So there could be soil contamination. If you run into that scenario where you want 100% conclusive results on that, you can do soil testing throughout the property. I had a case where I think it was around $2,000 to $3,000 where we knew a tank was removed, but there was no record of testing, so they had it tested because it was a requirement from the lender. Now, it could be much more than that for bigger properties, but you can proactively soil test even if you don't know where a tank is. And I don't know their approach to that. They might just be doing samples all over the yard. That's a question you'll have to ask them. Okay, that's investigation clauses. Next, we're going to go into removal if you actually have one. But when it comes to clauses, Dan, am I missing anything there on contracts or clauses or wording?
No. I think that was pretty thorough. Something to think about as well if you're on the selling side is to look for those clauses. James mentioned the long, big, fat clause. That puts you in ongoing liability in perpetuity for the rest of that house's life. So if you see that clause in an offer when you're selling, just be aware of what it means as well.
Yeah. And we should mention that based on the market will come down to what you typically put in offers. When we're on the seller side and we're dealing with multiple offers, we're not letting any of those oil tank clauses pass. Buyers are just buying what they can get in those hot markets. But if we're on the buyer side and it's a one-on-one negotiation, we're going to really push hard to get that oil tank clause in there. So every circumstance is different. We've sold properties with oil tanks in. We've bought them with oil tanks in. But in most cases, the seller is obligated to remove it before a sale happens. And in most cases, lenders don't want to have oil tanks on properties that they lend on. But let's go back into this whole removal process. You've landed on an oil tank. You're a seller or you're a buyer that bought a property knowing that you had one, or you bought a property that you didn't know had one, but it has. You see that cap in the ground and it's there and you got to get it out. So step one is you got to get it out. We always recommend, particularly for sellers, to remove the tank as opposed to sell it with a tank in place. If you sell it with a tank in place, there's a lot of uncertainty there. It may only cost you $10,000 to remove it, but buyers might be valuing it at $50,000 because they don't know if there's contamination that exists. One, some buyers will just not buy it because there's a tank there. Two, some lenders won't lend on a property because you have to disclose it if a tank's there. So 99.9% of the time, we're going to suggest get that tank out before you sell your property. And to get that tank out before you sell your property, you hire an oil tank removal company. Every city's a little bit different, but just be prepared that you might need to get an arborist report. You might need to put up tree protection to protect the trees around where the removal's happening. And the oil tank removal company is going to excavate that tank. They're going to soil test around that tank. And they're going to pluck the tank and they're going to backfill it and restore it back to its original condition. Now, make sure they backfill it with sand, not soil, and you're going to have a big sinkhole in your property. But for myself personally, we had a removal of a clean tank, and the tree protection stuff was about $2,000 and the removal was about $5,000. That's your typical best case scenario. We run into a lot of scenarios that are around $10,000 to $15,000 for removal. That may be with a little bit of contamination. But it could be $100,000 plus if that tank is in a weird location or underneath a structure or underneath the foundation or if the contamination is seeped out to the neighbors. There's a lot of what ifs that could be very expensive. So just note that the worst case scenario is very bad. The likely worst case scenario is probably in that $10,000 to $50,000 range. The more common scenario seems to be about $10,000 to $15,000. And if you have a clean tank that's easy to remove, well, for us, it was $7,000. So that, I think, covers most of what I wanted to talk about for oil tank removal. Am I missing anything from the...
I do have a couple questions.
Sure, fire away, Danny.
And these are from the buying side.
Yeah.
What things do I need to be aware of if I am buying a property with a tank that the seller is unwilling to remove? The couple things that I want to note are, one, insurance is a lot more challenging, and lending may be challenging, but maybe just touch on those two things.
Yeah, you've basically nailed it. If you're doing things the right way, a seller is disclosing that a tank is there. A buyer is providing all these documents to their lender. The lender is going to see that a tank is there. Some lenders might be okay with it. Some lenders may not. I think it's going to come down to how qualified that buyer is. If you're buying a foreclosure and you barely have the down payment, that might be one thing, or past grow up. But if you're a buyer that has 50% down and high income, they might not care one bit. But my biggest concern for a buyer when buying a property that has a tank in it is, what is the lender going to say? You want those lending documents are complicated. You want to make sure that lender does not have an out, that you're getting that money on completion and you're not going to find out some bad news in the final day. That is number one concern. Number two concern is, how much does it cost to remove? And that's, unfortunately, you're not going to find out until you do it. Yeah. But that's the biggest concerns for buyers.
Do any houses in Greater Vancouver still use oil tanks?
Ooh. I have not run into an active oil tank user for an below ground oil tank. I think I've run into one that had an above ground oil tank that was being used. But that doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means that I haven't run into many. And I think the big thing to keep in mind when it comes to oil tank investigation is, you may have an oil tank sitting underground behind your backyard may affect you in no way at all. You might be a buyer that's willing to take on the risk of a tank being there. But when we're realtors talking you through this, we're always thinking about, well, what is it going to be like when you resell? What is that buyer going to be looking for? And I don't have a crystal ball, but my guess is 10 years from now, 20 years from now, lenders seem to be getting a little more sticky. So our biggest concern half the time when it comes to oil tanks being in the ground is not, is it going to affect you, but it's more like, how is this going to affect your resale if things get stickier down the road? And that we will have to wait and see. There are so many circumstances where you can't get 100% conclusive evidence that no tank exists. It's just the way that these homes are built and the obstacles that exist on typical properties. So anyway, I think that's it.
That's it.
Anything
I think
else?
you nailed it.
I hope you enjoyed this oil tank informative session. Thanks for watching.